I stood there in the middle of a world I was supposed to command, but which instead commanded me. Today, I, the Duke of Ashworth, was sacrificing my heart to save my very own ancestral name. The debt was too great, the pressure too absolute. Clarissa's fortune was the only key, and the cost was everything I truly valued. The ancient stone, the generations of ghosts, the silent judgment of the aristocracy, all of it was a gilded cage. I was prepared to step inside, seal the lock, and live a beautiful lie. But then I saw her, my true love, my only anchor, who society had branded as the mistress. Ashley. She shouldn't have been here. Every breath she took was a risk to her reputation. She represented the freedom I was about to abandon. She wasn't just here to watch me go. I knew her soul. She was here for a different reason, a forbidden, desperate reason. Whispering in breathlessness, she said, "Corwin, your grandfather's vault. It's not empty. Take it. Now, don't let them do this to you." I felt the cold metal against my ribs. A secret, a choice. She had risked utter ruin for me. If my mother caught her, Ashley would be socially and financially destroyed. The stakes were no longer a debt. They were Ashley's life. The Duchess, seeing the contact, takes a threatening step forward, her eyes blazing, saying, "Remove that woman." Now, I was at the altar. Clarissa was coming. The ceremony was beginning. But I was no longer the pauper duke. I was holding a secret that could save my name and grant me the freedom to choose my own future. The Duchess of Ashworth possessed a beauty that time had refined rather than diminished. Yet her touch, Corwin noted, remained as frostbitten as ever. She stood before the immense fireplace in the drawing room, where a robust fire did little to soften the chill she projected. Her gaze, sharp and assessing, was fixed not on him, her only son, but on the future she was determined to salvage. "Corwin," she began, her voice a low, precise instrument, "we have ceased the pretense. The ruin is complete. The creditors circle like jackals who have been promised a feast and are now quite impatient." He felt the familiar pressure constricting his chest, the weight of a century of titles and estates reduced to a debt ledger. "Mother, I understand the gravity of the situation, but there must be another way to settle the mortgages then. Than offering yourself up?" The Duchess cut him off with a look of supreme distaste. "There is no other way. The Rutherfords are vulgar, yes, but they are also obscenely wealthy. Miss Penelope Rutherford holds the key, Corwin, and she demands a ducal coronet. Do not allow your sentimentality to bankrupt this family entirely." She took a single, measured step closer. "You are not merely Corwin. You are the last bulwark against oblivion. You will court her, you will charm her, and you will marry her before the season ends. Is that clear?" The command was absolute, leaving no room for the counter-argument that haunted his thoughts, the silent, profound connection he held with another. Corwin merely inclined his head. The weight of the gold ring he was soon to accept feeling heavier than any sword he had ever carried. Later that evening, the Ashworths hosted a small, musical soiree, a calculated public display of normalcy the Duchess orchestrated with ruthless perfection. Corwin found himself maneuvering through clusters of lace and jewels, his hand perpetually near Penelope Rutherford's arm, a demonstration of commitment for all the right spectators. Ashley Vance, his oldest friend and confidant, was present as well, positioned near the back of the room, ostensibly admiring a landscape painting. The Duchess approached one of the guests, Lady Harrington, and spoke in a carrying whisper that was calculated to travel just the right distance. "Poor Ashley," she sighed, adjusting a pearl necklace. "She is such a dear, sweet girl, but so awkward in company." Corwin attempts to be kind, of course, being an old child at habit, but one must acknowledge that without resources or title, she is simply a social inconvenience one tolerates for the sake of the family history. The words were an ice-cold draft, a public erasure of Ashley's significance, turning her into a piece of decorative, yet slightly shabby, furniture. Corwin saw Ashley flinch almost imperceptibly, her attention sharpening on the painting as if committing every brushstroke to memory. He felt a sharp, sickening guilt, knowing his silence ratified his mother's decree. In the face of financial ruin, some relationships were simply not worth the cost of acknowledgement. Ashley Celine Wolfe felt the Duchess's words like a fine, sharp shard of glass embedded in her conscience. It was a calculated cruelty designed not just to wound her, but to sever her final legitimate link to Corwin. The public display of his impending engagement to Penelope Rutherford was a suffocating pressure, and Ashley knew that without drastic intervention, Corwin would sacrifice his future for the sake of a mortgaged past. This despair gave her the necessary ruthlessness to proceed. Her motivation lay not in romantic desperation, but in a final, cryptic communique from the late Duke, Corwin's grandfather. Days before he succumbed to his illness, he had pressed a folded piece of ancient vellum into her hand, his eyes possessing a clarity that belied his frailty. It was not a tearful farewell, but a precisely worded directive in a barely legible hand. The roots of Ashworth are where the sun does not touch. Look to the oldest seal, Celine. The instruction had been a constant, burning puzzle. It drove her from a superficial drama of the drawing rooms into the sprawling, neglected quiet of the estate study. After a morning spent in the dusty quiet of the library, poring over faded estate surveys, she located a brittle, leather-bound inventory. A crude, penciled annotation marked a forgotten boundary line far past the formal gardens, the steward's sepulchre sealed. That night, Ashley, cloaked in dark wool and carrying only a small, hooded lantern, crossed the boundary. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. Following the rudimentary map, she navigated a dense, unkempt thicket, the briars snagging her dress and scratching her hands, until she reached the base of an enormous, ancient oak. There, almost entirely swallowed by ivy and root systems, stood a small, rectangular stone structure. This was no sepulchre. It was a vault. A heavy, tarnished bronze disc was set into the reinforced oak door the oldest seal the Duke had mentioned, a crest predating the current ducal line, depicting a coiled serpent around key. The lock mechanism was formidable, mocking her small set of skeleton keys. This was her only chance, a frantic, clumsy attempt to circumvent the Duchess's brutal solution. The official narrative was ruined. The Duke's note suggested buried truth. Realizing finesse was useless, Ashley retrieved a heavy, river-smooth stone she had carried from the stream bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the sound almost as loud as the first desperate strike she made against the thick iron bolt. The blow echoed in the dense, suffocating silence of the night, a metallic thunder that felt entirely too loud. She struck again, and then a third time, driven by the cold urgency of Corwin's timeline. The metal shrieked in protest, the bolt bending sideways with a sound of terrible finality. With a strained heave, she pulled the damaged lock free. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, releasing a breath of air that smelled profoundly of dust, parchment, and the deep, cold earth. Ashley raised her lantern, stepping across the threshold into the stifling dark. The desperate gamble had begun. The heavy door of the vault yielded, but the expected sight of glittering, hoarded wealth was absent. Ashley's small lantern revealed only a cramped, circular chamber of rough-hewn stone, choked with cobwebs and the skeletal remains of long-dead rodents. There were no coffers of gold, no stacks of ancient currency, nothing that could immediately settle the Duchess's towering debts. The Duke's clue seemed to have led to nothing but an old, forgotten storage space. Frustration, cold and bitter, threatened to overwhelm her. But the Duchess's cold dismissal, Corwin's despair, and the weight of the vellum note forced her concentration back to the silence. Running her fingers along the rear wall, coated in fine, dry dust, she detected a slight misalignment. It was not a smooth flagstone, but a small, carefully cut block that gave way under focused pressure, revealing a niche large enough only for a single object. Tucked within the hollow was a heavy object wrapped in oilskin. As Ashley pulled it free and stripped the covering, she found not an old deed or a jeweled box, but a stunning anachronism. A small, dark ledger, dense and modern, secured by a smooth metallic face and a digital lock. This was the true buried treasure, a record of truth protected by the anonymity of technology, a device that had no business being hidden beneath a duke's family seal. She knew, with a rush of certainty that banished the vault's chill, that this ledger contained the full, accurate accounting of the Ashworth estate, the one her late friend had died protecting. The ruin must be a carefully managed illusion. There was no time to decipher the password or crack the encryption. The church bells were pealing in the distance, a solemn, rhythmic toll that spoke of minutes, not hours. Clutching the heavy electronic ledger like a shield, Ashley scrambled back through the vault door, yanking the damaged bolt shut behind her with a final, echoing crash. The morning mist still hung low over the formal gardens, but the crisp air was already ringing with the sound of carriage wheels and the excited murmur of guests heading toward the chapel. Ashley ran, abandoning all pretense of dignity, tearing across manicured lawns and gravel paths, her lungs burning with the effort. Her fine dress was snagged and filthy, her hair unbound, but the only thing that mattered was the dark, heavy rectangle in her grasp. She burst through the heavy oak doors of St. Jude Chapel, just as the organist reached the grand crescendo of the processional. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, the gathered aristocracy turning as one to stare at the disheveled spectacle in the doorway. At the head of the aisle, bathed in the stained glass light, Corwin stood rigid by the altar. Penelope Rutherford, shimmering in white silk, had just reached his side. The bishop, positioned between them, raised his hand in a gesture of solemn commencement. Corwin turned his head at the sound of the disruption, his eyes, hollow and resigned, finding hers. For a terrifying, suspended moment, the entire wedding party faded into a haze of color. Ashley had traversed darkness and secrecy, the weight of the family history, and the physical distance of the estate. She had arrived just as the binding words were about to begin, her breath hitching on a desperate, silent plea. The paralyzing silence of the chapel broke as the Duchess, Clarissa, started forward with a hiss of silk, but Corwin moved first. He was no longer the resigned figure. The sight of Ashley, ragged and holding the anachronistic device, jolted him awake. Meeting her urgent gaze, he knew the time for deference was over. He stepped away from Penelope, who watched with mounting horror, and met Ashley at the chancel steps. "What is this?" he demanded, taking the heavy ledger. "Your grandfather's truth," Ashley whispered, desperation evident. Corwin placed his thumb on the metallic face. The lock silently disengaged, and the screen flared to life, showing a complex, color-coded interface. In one damning moment, Corwin saw it all. The true, massive liquid assets carefully hidden in shell corporations, the illusion of crippling debt fabricated over 3 years, and the final transfer document, waiting for his signature, that would move the majority of the fortune directly to accounts controlled by his mother and Penelope's father. He looked from the screen to his mother's frozen, beautiful face, and then to Penelope, whose eyes had shifted from shock to blatant calculation. The realization of the familial betrayal, the manipulation, the cold-blooded theft, was a physical blow. Turning his back on the altar, Corwin raised the ledger high, displaying the incriminating balance sheet to the stunned assembly. "This wedding is dissolved." His voice rang with devastating clarity, echoing through the chapel. "This ledger reveals that the Ashworth estate is not bankrupt. It is, in fact, immensely solvent." He let his gaze settle on his mother. "This pretense of ruin was orchestrated by my mother, the Duchess, and the Rutherford family, to coerce me into signing away my family's wealth. They sought to steal what they claimed to save. Penelope, your cooperation in this deceit has ended. The ceremony, the debt, the entire miserable year, It had all been a lie constructed to strip him bare. The truth, electronic and undeniable, stood between the betrayers and the truth, creating chaos in the heart of the chapel. The weight of Corwin's final statement settled upon the chapel like a shroud, turning the hushed room into a spectacle of frozen, gilded shock. He lowered the digital ledger, the light from its screen catching the polished marble of the altar. "I call off this wedding," Corwin declared, the words ringing with the authority of a man reclaiming his sovereignty. "The truth, ladies and gentlemen, is simple. The House of Ashworth is secure, having been protected by my late grandfather's foresight. The debts are settled. The estate is flourishing. The only crisis present here is one of character and greed." A ripple of audible gasps swept through the pews, followed by the vicious, rapid whisper of scandal. Penelope Rutherford stood stunned, her elaborate veil trembling. The mask of polite society was slipping, revealing the raw avarice beneath. The Duchess Clarissa, however, moved past shock and into pure, incandescent rage. Her control, so meticulously maintained for decades, fractured entirely. Her face, usually a study in cool indifference, contorted into a snarl. "You fool," she spat, discarding all social constraint. Her voice, no longer the precise instrument of manipulation, was a ragged shriek. "After all the sacrifices, all the years I spent restoring our name, you would throw it away for a pathetic little mouse and a few electronic toys? That fortune was mine to control. You were weak, Corwin, too weak to wield real power. I was building a dynasty." Her furious outburst, a raw admission of her ambition and her contempt for him, confirmed every dark suspicion Corwin had ever harbored. The Duchess's public self-exposure completed the humiliation of the Rutherfords and clarified the sheer extent of the deception. The high society veneer had vanished entirely, leaving only the sight of a furious woman consumed by her thwarted greed, exposed before all those she sought to impress. The wedding was canceled, the engagement broken, and the truth, harsh and liberating, lay bare for the world to see. They retreated from the pandemonium of the chapel not in flight, but in shared, stunned silence, seeking the sanctuary of the Duke's private study. The polished wood and familiar scent of aged tobacco offered a stark contrast to the electronic device Corwin now placed on the mahogany desk. This small, heavy ledger held the key to the empire his mother had falsely claimed was collapsing. With Ashley leaning over his shoulder, Corwin navigated the complex cipher his grandfather had designed. They bypassed several layers of encrypted data until the screen displayed the true, unvarnished balance sheet of the estate. It was staggering. The Ashworth holdings were not merely solvent. They were structured into a massive, previously unknown shell company, Massey Global Enterprise. This isn't possible, Corwin breathed, his voice hollow by disbelief as his gaze fixated on the primary asset value. There were no mere mortgages and land deeds. Instead, the total was articulated with a breathtaking specificity: $5 billion in unassailable liquid assets. His grandfather had not simply hidden the family wealth. He had generated a new fortune, insulating it entirely from the ducal title and, critically, from the hands of the Duchess Clarissa. The subsequent documents confirmed the late Duke's brilliant, ruthless strategy. The pretense of ruin had been a necessary theatrical performance, designed to expose his wife's greed and protect Corwin from signing away his future. A final, concise legal declaration followed the financial data. The sole and unconditional beneficiary, having proven his character through trial and adversity, is Corwin Alastair Ashworth, 18th Duke of Ashworth. The title, the money, the estate, all were confirmed as his own, now and forever. The financial ruin was a malicious fantasy, and the true legacy was a private empire, placed deliberately within Ashley's desperate reach. Corwin did not linger in the shock of his newfound billions. The emotional sting of his mother's betrayal was now weaponized by the undeniable proof in his hands. The ledger, his grandfather's masterstroke, was not just an accounting record. It was a fully prepared legal instrument. Within the files, Corwin found sealed documents, pre-signed by the late Duke, authorizing a specific firm of lawyers in the city to execute an immediate restructuring and transfer of control based on the digital evidence. With Ashley still at his side, Corwin made two precise calls. The first was to his grandfather's solicitor, Mr. Avery, a man whose loyalty Clarissa had long attempted to compromise. Corwin provided the secure digital code to access the corresponding legal trust. The second call was brief and cutting. He informed the estate manager, a known accomplice of Clarissa, that his services were terminated and his accounts frozen, effective immediately. The legal power play was executed with the chilling speed of a well-rehearsed maneuver. By mid-afternoon, before the last guest had departed the grounds in scandalized fury, legal notices were served. These injunctions barred both the Duchess Clarissa and the entire Rutherford family from any access to or claim over the Ashworth estate funds, the titles, or the newly revealed Massey global enterprise. The illusion of bankruptcy was not just shattered. It was inverted, leaving Clarissa and her co-conspirators abruptly impoverished relative to the vast wealth they had sought to acquire. Corwin was not only the Duke. He was the sole master of a $5 billion legacy, and the iron gate of the law had just clanged shut on his mother's ambition. The time for sentiment was over. The era of consequences had begun. The legal storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, almost eerie stillness at Ashworth. The study now felt less like a hideout and more like the operational center of a new world. Corwin, stripped of the pressure of false bankruptcy and the expectations of a mother's manipulation, finally felt like himself. Not merely the Duke, but the architect of his own future. He knew a final, public declaration was required, not for the sake of gossip, but for the sake of truth. Corwin arranged an impromptu, small press statement in the estate's library, the very room where Ashley had found the initial clues. When he faced the cameras, his expression was calm, resolute, and utterly devoid of the resignation that had defined him for the past year. "The title is a legacy I respect," Corwin stated, gesturing to the aged scrolls on the shelves, "but is not my identity. The prestige of the ducal title is an empty thing without integrity at its core. I will maintain the estate, of course, but my true focus, as revealed today, will be on Massey global enterprise, where real work is done and real fortunes are made." He spoke briefly of the deceit, confirming the legal actions against Clarissa and the Rutherfords. But his tone was clinical, dismissing their actions as a mere footnote to a greater opportunity. When he concluded the business matters, he turned, his focus shifting entirely to the woman standing quietly near the fireplace. Ashley, still in her slightly torn dress, her face smudged with dust but radiant with relief, was the center of his attention. He offered her his hand, and she took it, stepping forward with the steady confidence of someone who had just faced down a collapsing empire. Corwin looked directly at the reporters, his voice deepening with genuine emotion. "I was prepared to sign away my freedom, my fortune, and my happiness to preserve a falsehood. I was a man lost, believing the lie of our ruin," he admitted. "But the man you see before you is saved, not by gold, but by courage. Miss Ashley Celine Wolfe risked everything, broke into a forgotten crypt, and exposed the conspiracy that would have destroyed my life. She did not save my title, she saved my soul." Corwin looked down at Ashley, his gaze fierce with a love that transcended titles and bank balances. He brought her hand to his lips, then, without fanfare, slipped his grandfather's simple, strong signet ring onto her finger. I am done courting wealth and titles. I choose truth and courage. Ashley Celine Wolfe is my partner, my fiancée, and the only legacy I will ever truly need. The cameras flashed, capturing the image of the newly liberated Duke and the woman who had brought him the digital truth. The era of the cold hand was over. The Duke had chosen the warmth of love. The scandal faded, as all society scandals must, replaced by the relentless, quiet work of building a genuine empire. 6 months after the aborted wedding, Ashworth Estate remained their home, but it was no longer a cage. Corwin and Ashley, now inseparable partners in every sense, had entirely redefined its purpose. The grand drawing rooms were converted into executive offices. The estate archives became the legal backbone of the revitalized Massey global enterprise. Their partnership was one of seamless, formidable intellect. Corwin brought the inherited acumen for high finance, now sharpened by betrayal and guided by a fierce sense of ethical clarity. Ashley, free from the role of social inconvenience, proved to be the keen-eyed strategist who had the practical vision to turn billions into constructive, sustainable ventures. They built their company on a foundation diametrically opposed to Clarissa's and the Rutherfords' greed. Transparent dealings, merit over pedigree, and investments that created actual value, not simply speculative profit. They became the quiet, powerful disruptors of the financial world, using their vast wealth to reshape sectors they deemed stagnant. The ducal title, once Corwin's primary identity, was now merely a convenient piece of letterhead, used for formal correspondence and little else. The empty prestige of the peerage held no sway against the immense, practical power they wielded globally. The few invitations Corwin did accept to society functions were purely strategic, used to subtly illustrate the fundamental difference between the aristocratic duty he had escaped and the self-determined purpose he now lived. His mother, Clarissa, exiled by the unforgiving terms of the settlement and stripped of her social standing, was a ghost of the past, confined to the sidelines of the world she valued most. Looking out across the sprawling grounds of Ashworth one evening, Ashley's hand resting lightly on his arm, Corwin finally understood the entirety of his grandfather's lesson. The vault had not held $5 billion. It had held the freedom to choose. The greatest win was never the money. That was merely the tool. The triumph was in the clarity that allowed him to discard the suffocating weight of false obligation and reach for true happiness. He had exchanged a life of empty, hereditary duty for a life of meaningful, earned power, and a partner whose courage had proven infinitely more valuable than any coronet. Their dynasty would not be defined by who they were born to be, but by what they chose to build together. Thank you for watching this video to the end. I know you enjoyed it, and if you want to enjoy more beautiful stories like this, please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for your support. See you on the next one.